Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya with an iron fist. Both men committed documented atrocities against their own people. Western governments tolerated both for decades. The United States sold weapons to Iraq throughout the 1980s. European leaders welcomed Gaddafi back into the international community in 2004. These men remained in power, protected by Western indifference, for a combined total of 70 years. Then each man made the same decision. Within 36 months of making this decision, each man was dead. One executed by hanging, one beaten to death in a drainage ditch. The decision had nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction. Both men announced plans to stop selling oil in US dollars. Oil did not give these nations power. The dollar did. The moment they tried to escape the dollar, they became targets. The moment they became targets, the full machinery of American financial and military power mobilized against them. The official justifications came later. The sanctions came first, the bombs came second, the regime change came third. This sequence has repeated with documented precision for 50 years. The pattern holds across different administrations, different political parties, different stated reasons for intervention. Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, conservative coalitions, liberal coalitions. The dollar remains the constant. The dollar remains the trigger. The architecture keeping the US dollar dominant in global trade does not rest on American economic productivity. It rests on a single agreement signed in 1974 between Washington and Riyadh. This agreement created a system where every nation on earth requiring oil must first acquire dollars. The system forces global demand for U.S. currency regardless of American exports, American manufacturing, or American fiscal responsibility. This system allows the United States to print money without consequence. This system allows Washington to run permanent deficits while other nations practice austerity. This system makes the dollar untouchable. Anyone attempting to make the dollar touchable becomes a threat to the entire structure. Welcome to Finance Mythos, where we pull back the curtain on history's real players and the systems they built to stay in control. Today, you will learn the documented sequence of events preceding American intervention in Iraq and Libya. You will see the financial decisions erased from mainstream historical accounts. You'll understand why Iran faces maximum pressure sanctions, while Saudi Arabia faces none. And you will recognize the exact pattern now emerging with BRICS nations, Russia, and China. The dollar in your wallet maintains its value through a global enforcement system. When you understand the system, you understand why certain wars happen and certain dictators fall. When you understand the system, you understand the real foreign policy of the United States. The money trail starts in 1973, October 1973. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack against Israel on Yom Kippur. The war lasted 19 days. Israel survived with emergency American military assistance. Arab oil producers responded with an embargo against the United States and its allies. The embargo quadrupled global oil prices within months. American drivers waited in lines stretching for miles. The U.S. economy entered its worst recession since World War II. The stock market crashed. Inflation soared. The post-war American economic miracle appeared to be ending. Washington faced a crisis extending beyond gasoline prices. 2 years earlier, in August 1971, President Nixon had severed the dollar's connection to gold. Foreign governments holding dollars could no longer redeem them for gold at a fixed rate. The Bretton Woods system, the monetary architecture governing global finance since 1944, collapsed overnight. The dollar now floated against other currencies with no anchor, no gold backing, no guaranteed value. Foreign central banks holding dollar reserves watched those reserves fluctuate daily. Confidence in American currency eroded rapidly. The oil embargo accelerated this erosion. Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Saudi Arabia in 1974 with a proposal. The details remained classified for 41 years until Bloomberg News obtained the documentation in 2016. The proposal contained two provisions. First, Saudi Arabia would price all oil sales exclusively in US dollars. Every barrel of Saudi crude sold to any nation on earth would require payment in American currency. No exceptions, no alternatives. Second, Saudi Arabia would recycle its oil profits back into US Treasury securities. The kingdom would use its dollar earnings to purchase American government debt, effectively lending its oil revenue back to Washington. In exchange, the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, American weapons, American training, American security guarantees against regional rivals, including Israel. Saudi Arabia agreed. Other OPEC nations followed within months. By 1975, the petrodollar system was operational. The consequences transformed global finance permanently. Every nation importing oil now needed dollars. Japan needed dollars. Germany needed dollars. Brazil needed dollars. India needed dollars. These nations had to either export goods to America, borrow from American banks, or sell assets to American buyers to acquire the currency necessary for energy purchases. Global demand for dollars became structural. This demand existed independent of American economic performance. The United States could run trade deficits forever because the world required dollars regardless of what America produced. The recycling mechanism provided additional leverage. Saudi petrodollars flowed into Treasury securities, financing American government spending at artificially low interest rates. Washington gained the ability to fund military operations, social programs, and budget deficits with money borrowed from oil profits. The Federal Reserve gained extraordinary power. Dollar demand allowed the Fed to expand money supply without triggering the inflation devastating other currencies. When other central banks printed money, their currencies weakened. When the Fed printed money, global oil demand absorbed the excess. The petrodollar system created what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called an exorbitant privilege. America alone enjoyed the ability to purchase real goods and services with currency it printed at will. Every other nation paid for this privilege through dollar accumulation. By 1980, the system operated as designed. Oil traded in dollars worldwide. OPEC revenues flowed into American assets. Foreign central banks held dollar reserves as insurance against energy price shocks. The dollar had replaced gold as the foundation of global monetary order. The system had one vulnerability. It depended on universal participation. If major oil producers accepted payment in other currencies, dollar demand would weaken. If dollar demand weakened, American monetary privilege would erode. If American monetary privilege eroded, the entire financial architecture supporting U.S. global power would fracture. This vulnerability created a red line. Washington would defend this red line with every tool available. November 6, 2000. The United Nations administered an oil for food program allowing Iraq to sell limited oil quantities despite international sanctions. Proceeds funded humanitarian purchases of food and medicine for Iraqi civilians suffering under the embargo. On this date, Iraq announced a change in payment terms. Baghdad would no longer accept dollars for oil sold through their program. Iraq demanded euros instead. The financial press dismissed the decision as symbolic protest. Iraq sold limited volumes under UN supervision. Saddam Hussein controlled none of the proceeds directly. The gesture appeared purely political, an expression of anti-American defiance with minimal practical impact. This analysis missed the point entirely. Iraq sat on the world's second largest proven oil reserves. The oil for food program was temporary. Sanctions would lift eventually. When sanctions lifted, Iraq would resume full production and independent sales. If Iraq established euro pricing during the embargo period, the infrastructure for permanent euro transactions would exist when normal trading resumed. Other OPEC members watched carefully. Iran had discussed euro pricing for years. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, expressed interest in dollar alternatives. Russia, a major non-OPEC producer, resented dollar dependence imposed by American financial dominance. Iraq's euro decision was a proof of concept. Baghdad demonstrated euro oil sales were operationally feasible. The UN administered the transactions without disruption. European buyers welcomed the arrangement. The precedent existed. Within the U.S. Treasury Department and Federal Reserve, officials recognized the threat. Declassified communications from this period reveal extensive analysis of dollar displacement scenarios. Working groups modeled the consequences of OPEC defection from dollar pricing. The conclusions were alarming. If oil exporters accepted euros, European currency demand would surge. The European Central Bank would gain the monetary flexibility Washington currently monopolized. American ability to finance deficits through currency issuance would diminish. Interest rates on Treasury debt would rise. The entire economic foundation of American global power would weaken. Regime change planning for Iraq accelerated through 2001. The September 11th attacks provided political justification, but classified briefings from Treasury and Federal Reserve officials to the National Security Council emphasized monetary considerations alongside security concerns. In March 2003, American and British forces invaded Iraq. Within 3 weeks, Baghdad fell. Within 3 months, the Iraqi oil ministry announced dollar pricing would resume immediately. The euro experiment ended with Saddam's government. The official narrative cited weapons of mass destruction. No weapons were found. The official narrative cited links to al-Qaeda. The 9/11 Commission found no operational connection. The official narrative cited democracy promotion. Iraq remains unstable 2 decades later. The dollar narrative explains the timeline. Iraq's euro decision preceded invasion by 28 months. The invasion reversed the euro decision within 90 days of regime change. The currency threat was eliminated with the government imposing it. This pattern would repeat. Muammar Gaddafi seized power in Libya through military coup in 1969. For 4 decades, Western governments maintained complex relationships with his regime. Libya faced sanctions during the 1980s and 1990s over terrorism allegations. Libya paid reparations and renounced weapons of mass destruction programs in 2003. Western leaders welcomed Gaddafi back into international respectability. Tony Blair visited Tripoli in 2004. Condoleezza Rice followed in 2008. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi signed friendship treaties with Gaddafi. French President Nicolas Sarkozy accepted Libyan campaign contributions. European oil companies signed exploration contracts worth billions. Gaddafi remained brutal throughout this rehabilitation. His security services tortured dissidents. His government suppressed political opposition. His family accumulated vast wealth through corruption. None of this prevented Western engagement. Between 2009 and 2011, Gaddafi pursued a project threatening Western financial interests more directly than his domestic repression ever threatened Western security. Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed pan-African currency called the gold dinar. African nations would use this currency for oil transactions and continental trade. The dinar would replace both the US dollar and the euro in African commerce. African central banks would hold gold reserves rather than dollar or euro reserves. Documentation from African Union summits reveals extensive discussion of the proposal. Feasibility studies commissioned by the Libyan Central Bank analyzed implementation pathways. Gaddafi lobbied African heads of state personally. The gold dinar threatened multiple Western interests simultaneously. Dollar displacement was the primary concern. Africa produced significant oil volumes. Nigeria, Angola, Algeria, and Libya itself ranked among major global producers. If African oil traded in gold dinars rather than dollars, the petrodollar system would fragment. Euro displacement concerned France particularly. The CFA franc, used by 14 African nations, was pegged to the euro and guaranteed by the French treasury. France maintained monetary influence across its former colonies through this arrangement. A gold dinar would eliminate French financial leverage in West and Central Africa. Gold itself posed ideological problems. The gold dinar would represent a return to commodity-backed currency. Western central banks had spent 40 years eliminating gold from monetary systems. A successful gold currency in Africa would validate criticisms of fiat money systems and potentially inspire similar movements elsewhere. Gaddafi's Libya held 143 tons of gold reserves. The Central Bank of Libya maintained additional holdings sufficient to capitalize the proposed dinar. Unlike Saddam's euro gesture, Gaddafi had resources to implement his vision. In February 2011, protests erupted in Benghazi following the Arab Spring uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. Within weeks, NATO intervened militarily, citing humanitarian concerns about Gaddafi's response to the uprising. The intervention destroyed Gaddafi's government within 8 months. Gaddafi himself died in October 2011, captured by rebel forces and killed extrajudicially. Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, received an email from advisor Sidney Blumenthal dated April 2, 2011. This email, released through Freedom of Information Act litigation, identified Gaddafi's gold dinar plan as a primary French motivation for intervention. The email stated French intelligence assessed Gaddafi had accumulated gold reserves specifically to establish an alternative currency undermining French financial interests in Africa. The email made no mention of humanitarian concerns. Libya's gold reserves disappeared during the conflict. The Central Bank of Libya reported significant discrepancies in post-war audits. International investigators have never fully accounted for the missing gold. The gold dinar died with Gaddafi. African currency integration efforts collapsed. The dollar and euro maintained their African market position. The threat was neutralized. 2 leaders, 2 currency challenges, 2 regime changes. The pattern held. Iran began exploring dollar alternatives decades before Iraq or Libya made their moves. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 severed American financial ties immediately. Iranian assets in American banks were frozen during the hostage crisis. The freeze demonstrated American capacity to weaponize dollar access against adversaries. Iranian strategists learned this lesson thoroughly. Since 1979, Tehran has pursued systematic de-dollarization of its oil trade. The Central Bank of Iran established bilateral currency swap arrangements with trading partners. Iran accepted rupees from India, yuan from China, lira from Turkey. These arrangements allowed oil sales without dollar conversion. Buyers paid in their own currencies. Iran used these currencies to purchase goods from the same trading partners. Barter mechanisms supplemented currency swaps. Iran traded oil for Chinese-manufactured goods directly, bypassing money altogether. Iran exchanged crude for Indian rice and pharmaceuticals. These arrangements left no dollar footprint for American regulators to track or sanction. The European Union created INSTEX in 2019, a special purpose vehicle allowing European companies to trade with Iran without using dollar-based payment systems. INSTEX processed transactions through euro-denominated credits, avoiding the SWIFT network entirely. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, processes most international dollar transactions. The network routes payment messages between banks globally. American officials pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks in 2012 and again in 2018. Iran's SWIFT disconnection made normal dollar transactions impossible. Tehran responded by developing alternatives. The Iranian financial system adapted to swift exclusion through correspondent banking relationships in Dubai, Turkey, and Malaysia. Informal money transfer networks called hawalas moved funds outside electronic banking systems entirely. These adaptations work imperfectly. Iran pays significant premiums for workaround transactions. Insurance costs for Iranian oil shipments exceed normal rates. Currency conversion through intermediaries adds expense. The Iranian economy suffers from isolation despite adaptation. Yet Iran persists. 4 decades of sanctions have failed to collapse the Iranian government. 4 decades of financial pressure have failed to end Iranian dollar avoidance. 4 decades of maximum pressure campaigns have failed to produce regime change. The contrast with Iraq and Libya is instructive. Iraq had limited time between its Euro announcement and American invasion. Saddam Hussein had 28 months to build alternatives. The infrastructure for sustained resistance never developed. Libya had even less time. Gaddafi's gold dinar remained in planning stages when NATO intervention began. No operational currency system existed to survive his overthrow. Iran built resistance infrastructure over 40 years. The Iranian population adapted to sanctions conditions. The Iranian government developed sophisticated evasion mechanisms. The Iranian military prepared for potential conflict throughout this period. American military planners recognized the difference. Iraq, in 2003, faced a military weakened by 12 years of sanctions and the destruction of the 1991 Gulf War. Libya, in 2011, had no military capacity to resist NATO air power. Iran possesses missile systems capable of threatening American bases throughout the Middle East. Iran possesses proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Iran possesses terrain and population favoring defensive warfare. The military option remains available. The military option also remains costly beyond any previous intervention. This cost calculation, rather than legal or moral constraints, explains Iran's continued survival. Iran's persistence demonstrates the limits of the petrodollar enforcement mechanism. When target nations possess sufficient defensive capability and sufficient time to build resilience, the pattern breaks down. Regime change remains the preference. Regime change is not always achievable. The Iranian case reveals something else. Washington treats dollar avoidance as a casus belli, regardless of other considerations. Iran signed the nuclear agreement in 2015. Iran accepted intrusive inspections. Iran limited enrichment activities. The Trump administration withdrew from the agreement anyway and reimposed maximum sanctions. The nuclear issue provided political framing. The dollar issue drove policy continuity across administrations. Obama sanctioned Iran. Trump sanctioned Iran. Biden maintains sanctions on Iran. The pattern persists, independent of stated justifications. 5 decades of documented responses to dollar challenges reveal a consistent operational sequence. The sequence functions as an unofficial American foreign policy doctrine. Understanding the sequence explains events otherwise attributed to coincidence, ideology, or personality. Stage 1. Financial isolation. The first response to dollar defiance is economic pressure. Sanctions targeting banking relationships precede any military action. The goal is making normal international commerce impossible for the target nation. Swift disconnection represents the most powerful financial weapon. Without swift access, banks cannot send or receive international wire transfers through normal channels. Trade financing becomes difficult. Letters of credit cannot be issued. Import and export businesses struggle to operate. Secondary sanctions extend pressure to third parties. Any company doing business with the target nation faces exclusion from American markets. Any bank processing transactions for the target nation faces dollar access restrictions. The threat of secondary sanctions forces multinational corporations and foreign banks to choose between American markets and the target nation. They choose American markets every time. Iraq faced comprehensive sanctions from 1990 to 2003. Libya faced sanctions through the 1990s, saw them lifted briefly, then faced renewed sanctions in 2011. Iran has operated under some form of American sanctions continuously since 1979. Stage 2. Propaganda. Preparation. Financial isolation alone rarely produces regime change. The population suffers. The government adapts. Sanctions create grievances against the imposing power rather than against the domestic regime. Military intervention requires public justification. The second stage constructs narratives legitimizing force. These narratives focus on topics generating emotional response: weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, human rights atrocities, threats to regional stability. Iraq faced accusations of active WMD programs. United Nations inspectors found nothing. Intelligence agencies produced assessments, later revealed as manipulated or fabricated. Colin Powell presented satellite imagery, later acknowledged as meaningless. The narrative served its purpose regardless of accuracy. Libya faced accusations of imminent genocide against civilians in Benghazi. Human rights organizations later found no evidence supporting these claims. Death tolls from government response to protests were significant but not genocidal. The narrative served its purpose regardless of accuracy. Iran faces accusations of nuclear weapons development. Intelligence assessments consistently report no active weapons program. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed Iranian compliance with the 2015 agreement before American withdrawal. The narrative serves its purpose regardless of accuracy. The propaganda stage does not require accurate claims. It requires claims sufficient to neutralize domestic political opposition to military action. It requires claims sufficient to secure international coalition support, or at least neutrality. Accuracy becomes a matter of post-war historical debate rather than pre-war policy constraint. Stage 3. Military intervention or proxy warfare. Direct military action follows financial isolation and propaganda preparation when conditions permit. Iraq faced ground invasion. Libya faced air campaigns supporting armed rebellion. These interventions occurred when target nations lacked capacity for effective defense. When direct intervention risks excessive costs, proxy warfare substitutes. Iran faces support for domestic opposition movements, ethnic separatist groups, and regional adversaries. Saudi Arabia receives American weapons used in Yemen against Iranian-aligned forces. Israel receives American support for operations against Iranian positions in Syria. The goal remains regime change. The method adapts to circumstances. Stage 4. Financial system reconstruction. Successful regime change produces immediate currency realignment. Iraq restored dollar pricing within months of Saddam's fall. Libya never implemented the gold dinar. Post-intervention governments demonstrate immediate compliance with dollar system requirements. Reconstruction contracts flow to American and allied corporations. Oil production agreements favor Western companies. Central bank reserves return to dollar holdings. The target nation reintegrates into the system it attempted to escape. This sequence explains why certain brutal regimes face intervention while others receive support. Saudi Arabia maintains dollar pricing and petrodollar recycling. Saudi Arabia dismembers journalists and executes dissidents without American sanction. The United Arab Emirates maintains dollar alignment. The UAE exploits migrant labor and suppresses political opposition without American sanction. The determining variable is not human rights. The determining variable is not terrorism. The determining variable is not democracy. The determining variable is dollar compliance. The petrodollar system faces its greatest challenge since 1974. Multiple major economies now pursue de-dollarization simultaneously. The enforcement mechanisms effective against individual nations struggle against coordinated multilateral alternatives. BRICS expansion represents the primary threat. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa formed an economic partnership in 2009. The bloc expanded in 2024 to include Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia received an invitation and continues negotiations. BRICS nations collectively produce more oil than they consume. They represent over 40% of global population. Their combined GDP exceeds the G7 by purchasing power parity measurement. This bloc possesses resources to construct alternative financial infrastructure the petrodollar system cannot easily suppress. China leads de-dollarization efforts within BRICS. The yuan now settles more international trade than the euro. Chinese oil imports from Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia increasingly price in yuan. The Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange offers yuan-denominated energy contracts. Russia's 2022 Ukraine invasion accelerated de-dollarization dramatically. Western sanctions froze Russian central bank reserves held in dollars and euros. This freeze demonstrated vulnerability inherent in holding reserves within Western financial systems. Every central bank holding dollar reserves recognized the threat. If the United States and European Union could freeze Russian reserves, they could freeze any nation's reserves. The only protection was reducing dollar holdings and developing alternative payment systems. Central bank gold purchases reached record levels in 2022 and 2023. China, Russia, Turkey, India, and numerous smaller nations accumulated physical gold as reserve diversification. Gold cannot be frozen by foreign governments. Gold cannot be deleted from electronic ledgers through sanctions. Saudi Arabia began accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases in 2023. This development breaks the 1974 agreement directly. Saudi Arabia no longer prices all oil exclusively in dollars. The cornerstone of the petrodollar system has cracked. The American response follows familiar patterns. Russia faces comprehensive sanctions exceeding those imposed on any previous target. Iran faces continued maximum pressure. China faces technology export restrictions, tariff escalations, and financial pressure on Chinese companies. These measures produce limited effect. Russia continues selling oil to China and India at discounted prices. Iran exports oil despite sanctions through established evasion networks. China's economy continues growing despite American restrictions. The military option against these nations does not exist. Russia possesses nuclear weapons capable of destroying American cities. China possesses nuclear weapons and conventional forces sufficient to impose unacceptable costs. Iran demonstrated defensive capabilities in April 2024 when it launched direct strikes against Israel without triggering effective Israeli response. The enforcement mechanism that destroyed Iraq and Libya cannot operate against nuclear-armed great powers or nations with sufficient conventional deterrence. The pattern breaks when the target nation reaches certain defensive thresholds. You live within this transition. The dollar in your wallet maintains purchasing power through a global system now fragmenting. The United States government finances its operations by selling debt to foreign central banks now reducing their dollar holdings. The interest rates you pay on mortgages, car loans, and credit cards reflect global demand for Treasury securities now declining. Your government maintains military bases in 80 countries to enforce a financial system now facing organized resistance. Your tax dollars fund operations targeting nations pursuing the same monetary independence the United States would demand if positions were reversed. The history you learned in school described American interventions as democracy promotion, humanitarian protection, or self-defense against terrorism. The documents now declassified reveal financial calculations driving decisions attributed to idealism. Iraq's weapons of mass destruction never existed. Iraq's euro oil pricing existed and was eliminated. Libya's imminent genocide never materialized. Libya's gold dinar plans materialized and were eliminated. Iran's nuclear weapons program remains unconfirmed by every international inspection. Iran's de-dollarization continues despite 40 years of pressure. The pattern is documented. The evidence is public. The connection between dollar defiance and regime destruction is no longer conspiracy theory. It is historical record. What happens next depends on whether BRICS nations succeed in building alternatives too robust for American suppression. It depends on whether Saudi Arabia completes its defection from exclusive dollar pricing. It depends on whether the enforcement mechanisms that worked against isolated targets function against coordinated great power resistance. You will experience the consequences of this transition. Your savings will fluctuate, your purchasing power will change, your government's fiscal options will narrow or expand depending on outcomes beyond your control. Understanding the petrodollar system gives you no power to change it. Understanding the petrodollar system gives you knowledge to recognize what your leaders describe as security policy is often monetary policy in disguise. Understanding the petrodollar system gives you framework to evaluate claims justifying future interventions against nations you are told threaten your safety. The next time your government identifies a foreign leader as a monster requiring removal, ask one question. Check whether this leader announced dollar alternatives before the accusations began. The answer will reveal whether you're witnessing security policy or enforcement operations. The money trail tells the truth. Follow it. This is finance mythos. We name history's owners. Now you know one of the systems keeping them in control. The next war will have a price tag. The official explanation will not include it. But the ledger exists. The ledger always exists. And now you know where to look.